on 2U Breakfast. It's Tech Talk, Tech Talk, Tech Talk, Tech Talk, Tech Talk, Tech Talk, Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson.
You like that, don't you?
I do like it. I swear it seems to get longer each week, but I'm sure it doesn't.
There'll be one time when we won't do anything but that.
That'll be the whole segment.
Mathew Dickerson and Tech Talk. I'm curious, the note you sent to me that said COVID-19 has hit sales of smartphones. In other words, 14% reduction. Now, in my stupid brain, Matty, I would have thought because we can't communicate or touch others, that mobile phone purchases would have gone up.
Well, I think there is, and this is worldwide too,
Why didn't it go
Richard.
up?
This is 285 million shipments of phones across the world.
285 million.
285 million across the world.
That's a chunk of change for me.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's smartphones. So multiply that by maybe $1,000 per smartphone. So you get a few more dollars there. But the bottom line is that I think you're right that communication requirements went up during COVID-19, but in a different format. So I think people were trying to save a bit of money, so they may not have gone out and bought a smartphone, but they were buying internet devices to allow them to connect to the internet, broadband stuff.
Okay.
So those sales went up.
So we were buying, what, laptops?
No. Buying mobile broadband devices,
Oh,
for
okay,
example.
right.
So
And
devices,
not smartphones.
not smartphones,
Right.
because we were trying to get communicating in another way. In other words, we maybe had our smartphone to make phone calls on, but when we wanted to do a Zoom call or remote meeting, get connected to the internet on our computer, for example, we needed a device to do that and do that in a faster, better way. So sales of those devices went up. So they're little mobile broadband devices, they're internet connected devices, there sometimes it might have been NBN connections, all those things went up. Internet usage went up, but the actual sales of smartphones across the world went down by 14%.
So what is a smartphone missing that the other devices can get?
Convenience. Yeah, and I suppose to a certain extent speed. So you can set up your smartphone with a hotspot to be able to let your computer
Does
connect
an
to
idiot
it.
have a smartphone?
Sorry?
Does an idiot have a
I think there are lots of idiots that have smartphones.
right.
So I
That's
think
interesting, though.
the idea is you can do that with a smartphone, but an internet connected device or a mobile broadband device allows you to turn it on once and then multiple devices can connect to it. So your TV, so you can watch your streaming shows, and your computer. So various devices, your tablets, all those sort of things can connect to that one device. So it's convenience.
Okay. How much does a smartphone cost, did you say?
Well, look, I don't have an exact figure for an average, but there are some smartphones that are up around $2,000. Some are as cheap as a few $100s, but roughly I would say that you're probably spending on average across all those, maybe close to $1,000 per phone.
Okay. So is smartphone manufacturing going to improve what it can do so it doesn't get left in the dark during these times?
Well, there's certainly been change already. In fact, the head of Foxconn is a company that many people didn't hear of a few years ago because they were behind the scenes manufacturing for most of the major organisations. So the Apples and the Samsungs and all sorts of different companies, they were manufacturing, and they've basically come out now and they said that they don't believe China is going to be the factory of the world going forward with a whole range of tariffs and maybe some anti-China sentiment. They're actually looking at taking their manufacturing processes to Vietnam and to Taiwan and a whole range of other places that are still cheap, like India is obviously another place they're looking at, still cheap for labour, but doesn't have all those implications of dealing with China in there. So that'll change.
Interesting, Matty Dickerson. You were just saying an anti-Chinese sentiment. Why? Because of the virus or what?
I think there's a few reasons for that. I think certainly some people are worried about the political landscape from China. I think some people still, there's been a bit of a beat up around, oh no, they introduced this virus to the world, we don't like them anymore. So I think there's a few reasons for that, but there are also some governments around the world that are almost pushing their residents to have an anti-China sentiment by putting tariffs on.
Look at what they're doing in Hong Kong.
Yeah, exactly right.
And all that sort of stuff that comes out. But we only see the tip of the iceberg of that kind of thing too, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
We only see what the Western media want us to see. You've got to
No,
realise
you're not saying that's propaganda, are you, Richard?
I'm not saying things like that. So 14%, that's a lot.
That's a big drop.
Big drop,
and that's
isn't
the first quarterly drop they've had for a decade. So when smartphones really, the whole segment was created by BlackBerry, but Apple iPhone really
remember the
started it off.
Blackberries?
Yeah, I love the BlackBerry. I think they were fantastic. But
where are they now?
no, they failed to
landfill.
see the landscape changing. They just didn't see what was happening. So in the last 10 years, every quarter, smartphone sales have gone up. So there's been growth every single quarter for the last 10 years since the first time there's a drop. Yeah.
And is this going to be exacerbated if this thing keeps going?
I think so, and I think who knows what the new normal will look like, Richard. It's very difficult to know what tomorrow's going to look like, and that's exactly right. So the next quarter will be interesting to see what happens to smartphone sales. I'll report back to you and tell you what happens after we get the figures in for the next quarter.
Yeah. What about you? Have you taken a hit at Axis or what?
Well, same as the worldwide market, we've found our smartphone sales have been down a little bit, but other products, broadband products and booster products, which we've advertised here on 2DU, we've found that those products have been filling that gap definitely that's been left by a drop in smartphone sales.
Interesting stuff, isn't it? So, and there's nothing you can do about it, is there, really?
Oh, there is. There's certainly, I look at our industry and what's happened around Australia with lots of stores. There's obviously hundreds of stores around Australia that are selling these same things, and different stores have taken different approaches and had different outcomes. So you can try your best and see what happens, but sometimes it's external factors.
All right, so who's selling the most smartphones these days?
Well, that's really interesting because the worldwide market, Samsung and Apple have traded first place for the last 10 years.
They used to have magnificent knees up too. I went to one in Vegas.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah,
You got everything.
The whole process of launching a new smartphone now is an event. That's an event in itself.
Hollywood hoopla.
Yeah, it is exactly
So
right.
who's leading the market?
So in the last quarter, for the first time in 10 years, it's someone besides Samsung and Apple. It's Huawei. Huawei have just taken over.
Wants them. America don't want them. We don't want them.
Yeah, they've got a big market over there in that little country called China, though. They sell a few phones over there.
People there, aren't they?
That's right. So they've just eclipsed Samsung into the number one spot. Samsung just been pushed back to number two. And what's fascinating about that is Apple's number three worldwide.
Number three worldwide.
Number three worldwide.
Apple
but
is.
in Australia, that's completely different. In Australia, Apple sell double the number of phones of Samsung. They're number one in Australia by a clear margin, and Huawei's back in number three. But keep in mind, Australia's only got about 1% of the overall world market.
Here comes the anti-Chinese sentiment.
Well, you probably see a bit of that, but Apple has been a leader, and it's often fascinating. You talk to people in Australia, and you say in the past Samsung might have been number one worldwide, and they don't understand. They say, what do you mean Samsung? Oh, I don't know anyone with a Samsung, but I know lots of people with an iPhone, and that's the thing. In Australia, Apple has been very strong, and again, typically doubled sales of Samsung for a number of years. Whereas you've got the worldwide market, they say Huawei number one, Samsung number two, or those two up around the number one spot.
So like the old days, Matt Dickerson, when you used to either have a Holden or a Ford, it's now Samsung and Apple.
Well, between those two, they've got 78% market share. So I think you're right. Most people...
Why? What causes somebody, like they come into you at Access and they say, I want this. How do they get convinced to go to Apple or Samsung? What's the difference? I mean, gadgets are gadgets, aren't they?
And you are spot on. It's the old Apple, Holden versus Ford.
Oh,
they were both good. They were both good cars. They both did basically the same thing. But exactly right. But if you talk to a Ford fan or a Holden fan, they'll tell you that absolutely that was the best one. And iPhones and Samsung Galaxy phones, they're both very good. The smartphones now, their cameras are fantastic. The amount of memory, the speeds on them, they're all fantastic. So it really is emotion more than practicality that drives the decision.
And who's running the ship at the time, I think, too.
That can have a bit to do with it. And the other thing that's fascinating, Richard, is what your friends and family have got. So if your friends and family have got one or the other, that's what you tend to go with.
And if your dad votes Labor, you've got to. And if your mum votes Liberal, you've got to do that too.
That's right.
All sorts of strife. We'll catch up. There it is. Interesting times. COVID's done more than just created panic amongst pandemics.
Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson.